Boldwood presents A Sister's Promise, written by Caroline Finnerty and read by Caroline Lennon. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Sydney, Australia. Penny Callahan stood alongside the railings at Bright Minds Preschool, pretending she was reading something on her phone, while the other parents chatted and made small talk with one another. One of the mums, Penny thought her name might be Miranda or Melanie, was telling the group about her struggles to get her daughter Casey to eat her vegetables, while the rest of them were offering up suggestions. Penny stood in the exact same place every day, never joining in, always trying to make herself invisible. They had tried to include her in the conversations, but when she never made an effort to chat back, they had soon got the message that she wanted to be left alone. Her old self would be horrified at what she had become, Penny thought. The old Penny would have been in the middle of that group. She would have been leading the conversation, telling them stories, making them laugh. Fun. That's what she used to be. She was practically unrecognisable even to herself anymore. It still shocked her how contracted her life had become, how small her world now was. You could try blending them in a sauce. I chop the veggies up and whiz them with some passata in the blender. Mason loves it. Doesn't even realise he's eating veg. Another parent laughed, just as the door opened, and Penny saw Miss Jolie appear holding the hand of the child who was first in line. The group stopped talking and looked up with eager faces, waiting for their child to appear, as one by one the children came running across the tarmac with smiling faces towards their parents. Finally, Penny saw Willow, and her heart soared, like it always did at the sight of her precious daughter, the only person in this universe who mattered. Sometimes, Penny felt as though it was her and Willow versus the whole world. "Mummy!" Willow cried as she ran towards her, with her lunch bag clasped inside her pudgy hand. She was wearing mint green cotton shorts, a white t-shirt, and a sun hat decorated with a daisy print. She wrapped her two arms around Penny's legs with such force that she was knocked off balance for a moment. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Penny asked. Although Willow had recently turned 4 and she was getting heavy, she scooped her up and sat her onto her hip. "Miss Jolie said it's only 10 more sleeps to Halloween." Penny still found her daughter's recent adoption of an Australian accent amusing. The way the intonation of her sentences ticked upwards at the end, as if she was asking a question. It had only happened since she had started preschool. Before that, Willow's accent had mirrored her own Irish accent. Although the accent was a small thing, Penny knew it signalled something bigger. This was the start of Willow's independence from her. The umbilical cord joining them together may have been cut at birth, but Penny imagined there was still one there, tethering Willow to her. Except, with every step Willow took into the world, it frayed a little more. It had been easy up until this point. She was able to shrink-wrap Willow's world so that it was only the two of them. But now, the boundaries of their unit had been pushed out a little, and Willow had the influence of her new classmates and teachers. Willow's world was opening up, her circle widening like ripples from a stone cast into a pond. But how Penny wished she could lock her daughter and herself inside a bubble and keep them safely there forever. While the other parents helped their children into their cars, Penny and Willow walked the short distance down the street towards the bus stop. They stood waiting under the blistering Sydney sun, feeling the intense midday heat on their skin. The road shimmered with the hazy film, the tar soft as licorice. At 41 years of age, Penny had spent almost half her life in Australia, but she was still trying to get used to feeling heat in October, when back in Ireland the temperature would be starting to drop as winter drew close. At home, people would be taking down their winter clothes from the attic and lighting the fire in the evenings, while here in New South Wales, people were cranking up their aircon. While they waited for the bus, Penny fished out the bottle of sun cream from her bag and dabbed some across her daughter's face. Willow's olive skin was golden from the sun, not like Penny's, which never changed past milk bottle white, despite being so many years in Australia. People thought it was funny how stereotypically Irish she looked, with her red hair and skin so pale that it was almost translucent. Willow's honey blonde hair contrasted so wildly with her own auburn colouring. People would nod towards Willow and say, "Her dad must have been dark." Such was the obvious difference in skin tone between them both. Penny knew they never meant harm, they were just trying to make conversation with her. But Penny would smile politely and offer no reply. No information. "Mummy?" Willow asked, as Penny squirted a large dollop of sun cream into her palm and began slathering it up along her daughter's arms. "Yes, sweetheart." "Do I have a daddy?" Penny felt her heartbeat quicken as she tried to work the thick sun cream into her skin. She used her arm to wipe away the sweat on her brow. "What are you asking that for?" she replied, trying not to sound rattled. "We were painting our families, and I did me and you, and Carter said I needed a daddy, and I said I just had a mummy. But Carter said I have to have a daddy for my family. I told him that I don't have a daddy, and then Miss Jolie came in, and she asked Carter to help her wash up the paint pots." "You, my dear," Penny said, as she wiped the remains of the greasy sun cream along her own arms, "have a mummy who loves you very much." She began tickling the child's rounded tummy, as Willow started to giggle. The deflection seemed to work, and Willow's question was soon forgotten. After a few minutes, the exhaust from the bus belched out fumes as it pulled up beside them. The hydraulic doors hissed apart, and they climbed on board, savouring the air conditioning. They made their way down to the same seats they sat in every day as they travelled the 10-minute journey home to Kookaburra Avenue. The dazzling high-rise towers of Sydney became miniature blocks in the distance, and the buildings became smaller, flatter, more squat, as the bus drove through the suburbs. Eventually, they arrived at their stop and stepped out into the searing heat again. Penny blew out through her lips to fan her forehead as they walked towards their block. When they arrived at the building, they began climbing the concrete steps leading up to their third-floor flat. The acrid smell of stale urine that always hung around the stairwell was intensified in the heat. "Careful, don't step on that, sweetie," she warned Willow, as she guided her around shards of brown glass from a broken beer bottle. "Can you carry me, Mummy?" Willow asked in her lispy voice when they were halfway up. Her legs always grew tired by the second floor. Penny put an arm under her knees and hoisted her up as she carried her for the last few steps. She placed Willow down when they got to the landing on the top floor. They turned right and walked along the graffiti-littered balcony. "Hayley loves Rick," a swastika, a stick man with a disproportionately large penis. When they reached the door to their flat, Penny wiggled her key in the lock, while simultaneously giving it a dig with her shoulder to get it to open. She pushed the door and quickly scanned the living area to make sure there was no one there, like she always did. Suddenly, they heard a crash coming from the kitchen area. Penny's heart began to hammer, and sweat pricked the back of her neck. Despite the heat, she now felt cold. Before taking another step, she quickly looked around the flat. In the kitchenette, she could see the net curtain at the window above the sink, billowing in the breeze. "Who's there?" she called, trying to sound braver than she felt. The air felt thick, too thick to breathe into her lungs. "Mummy, what's wrong?" Willow asked, reaching for her hand, her face turning anxious. "Me scared." Then the smell hit her nostrils, the pungent scent of charring, and she remembered. She had burnt toast that morning at breakfast and had opened the window to let out the smell. She must have forgotten to close it as they had rushed out the door. Stay calm, she told herself. He's not here. Is anyone there? She called. It was then she saw Twinkle, the ginger tabby that lived in the flat next door, appear in the doorframe. He must have come in through the open window. Penny took a deep breath, signalling to her body that everything was okay, and soon her heart rate began to steady. Would she ever stop feeling like this, she wondered? Would she ever be able to relax in her own home? Even after all this time, she was still afraid he would find her. She bent down, and the animal made its way over to her. See, love, it's only Twinkle, she assured Willow. Silly Mummy forgot to close the window earlier after I burnt the toast. Penny forced herself to smile for her daughter's sake. The cat snaked its way between her legs, rubbing itself along her bare ankles. Mammy is a silly Billy. Willow grinned back at her. Hi, Twinkle, she said, as she bent to stroke him. Mammy, can we get a cat? Maybe when you're bigger. But I'm 4 now. I'm a big girl, Willow protested. You need to be really big to have a cat. Maybe when I'm 5? Maybe, Penny replied noncommittally. Willow was always asking if they could get a cat. But right now, Penny's life was busy enough without adding an animal into the mix too. Penny turned and closed the front door behind them, sliding the bolt across and putting the chain on too. Then she walked into the kitchen and reached up to close the window. She caught her reflection in the glass and noticed how thin her face had got. It was almost gaunt. Her cheekbones were razor sharp, and her green-grey eyes seemed sunken inside their sockets. She saw the slice of a scar on her brow, and she turned away. She came back out to the living area, where Twinkle was now waiting at the door, wanting to be let out. I think Twinkle wants to go home, Mummy, Willow said. Penny took off the chain once more, undid the bolt, and as she opened the door to let him out, she noticed that there was an envelope stuck in the letter flap. She reached down and freed it. Her heart sank as she examined the official-looking white envelope, with its neatly typed address in the windowpane, and the red franked postage stamp. Please, not another bill, was her first thought, as she stood there with the letter clasped between her fingers. When would she ever get her head above water? Each month she felt she was sinking further and further below, and now the surface seemed too far away to ever break through. She had a pile of letters stuffed in a drawer in the kitchen, with the words "Final Reminder" inked in red across the top. And every week, when her employer, Mrs. Sullivan, left the envelope with her money on the table for her, she had to prioritise which one was the most urgent. She worked for the Sullivan family, cleaning their Bellevue Hill mansion, while Willow was in the preschool down the road. Mrs. Sullivan was a lawyer, and her husband was a tech millionaire. They had 3 school-going children, and liked to return home to a pristine house and a freshly made dinner left in the fridge to be reheated that evening. Penny had only met her twice, once when she had been interviewed for the job, and the second time was when Mrs. Sullivan had shown her around their home and told her what her duties would be. She let herself into their house every morning and surveyed the detritus of family life. She would lift their bowls that had been left on the table, still full of cereal and milk, and empty them down the sink. She would unload the dishwasher from the night before and load it again with the dirty breakfast dishes. She would pick up clothes from the floor and put them in the laundry hamper. She would make their beds, pulling the high thread count Egyptian cotton sheets tight for them to slip their bodies beneath that night. She would wash down the toothpaste from their sinks. She would wipe away their smudgy fingerprints from the floor-to-ceiling glass, so nothing marred their expansive views across the harbour. Penny always wondered what it would feel like to have your mess magically disappear, to have your life reordered day after day, to never dread a bill, or have the fear that when you went to purchase groceries, that your card was going to be declined. How liberating it must feel to live like that. Although the Sullivans were good to her, and paid her a decent hourly rate by housekeeper standards, it was still never enough. Penny was forever weighing up their needs. Food versus feeding the prepaid electricity meter. New shoes for Willow versus phone credit. There was so little left over every week after she had paid the rent, the bills, bought groceries, and paid their bus fares. The fear every month of being short, trying to prioritise which bill could be paid and which could be put off. The never-ending cycle of worry and responsibility sometimes felt as though it was choking her. She would lie awake in bed at night, concerned about it all, feeling as though there was a ton of concrete bricks pushing down on her chest. "Willow, will you put your bag in the bedroom?" she asked her daughter, needing the space to deal with whatever the envelope contained. She tried hard not to let Willow see how much the stress of trying to make ends meet affected her, but sometimes it was so hard when the worry was shadowing her constantly. Willow ran off towards the bedroom they shared together. The flat was small, with just a kitchen and living area, a single bedroom, and a bathroom. She and Willow shared a double bed, but even if Penny could afford somewhere bigger for them both to live, she would still choose to have Willow sleep with her every night. It was comforting to reach across the mattress and feel the curl of her daughter's small body against her own, to place a palm over her ribcage, to feel her tiny chest rise and fall with each breath she took. She knew a time would come where Willow would venture further away from her as she made her way out into the world, but for now she was going to keep her safely close to her while she still could. Penny slid her finger beneath the gummed seal and took out the letter from inside. She unfolded the paper and saw the logo for Sydney's St. Thomas's Hospital for Women at the top. She felt her stomach lurch, and the words seemed to dance around on the page before her. She'd almost forgotten about the biopsy that she had had carried out there last week. 3 months ago she had found a lump in her breast. She hadn't panicked. She was sure it was probably just a cyst or something equally benign. But when it hadn't gone away after a few weeks, she had decided to go to her doctor. She had been referred for a mammogram and ultrasound, and then the clinic had called her back for yet another appointment because they had wanted to do a biopsy. As she scanned through the letter, she saw that she had an appointment for the following week to discuss the results. She groaned internally. Now she would need to ask the Sullivans for another morning off. This would be the 3rd time this month. Even though Penny had explained that they were medical appointments, she knew by Mrs. Sullivan's frustrated sigh at the other end of the phone that she was losing patience. And she'd be down money again. Why did the doctor have to see her in person? Why couldn't they just give her the results over the phone? It was ridiculous. She knew this was probably just the way they had to do things. There were so many silly GDPR rules about patient confidentiality these days. Unless... No. She pushed the thought quickly from her head. Chapter 2. Kildare, Ireland. Laura Flood wiped down the countertop, even though it was already clean. She folded the cloth, placed it beside the sink, and looked around her. This had once been her dream kitchen. The shaker-style cupboards were painted a soft cream. The walls were primrose yellow, and a powder blue aga, framed by a farmhouse-style mantel, stood against the wall. A huge marble-topped island, where family and friends gathered around when they had people over, formed the centrepiece in the room. In summertime, she would open the French doors out onto the lawn and sit on the patio with her morning coffee. It was the heart of their home. Now, the kitchen was so quiet and tidy, and she hated it. Her children, Ella and Josh, were both at university, and she was still trying to adjust to the leap in their independence that came between leaving school and starting college. When the children had been small, life had been hectic. Between GAA matches, piano lessons, and art classes, it was go, go, go. She loved collecting them from school and listening to them chat in the back seat the whole way home. Back then, they would come in the door, throw their bags on the floor. No matter how many times she would tell them to put them in the boot room, she would still be tripping over them again the next day. They would pull out a seat at the island, and Laura would give them a snack while they told her about their day. Then she would help them with their homework, while she perused a cookery book for a recipe for their dinner that night. Ella was the first to leave home to go to University College Cork 2 years ago, and although the house was undoubtedly quieter without Ella's hairdryer blasting every morning, at least they still had Josh there. It wasn't until he had gone to the University of Limerick in September, and the nest was finally empty, that Laura realised just how quiet the house was, and she didn't like it. She missed hearing their feet taking the steps on the stairs 2 at a time, then rounding the kitchen door and asking, "What's for dinner, Mum?" Now they were forging their own way in the world, and Laura was still trying to adjust to that. Her children had both settled so well into college. They had busy social lives and rarely came home at the weekends. She was happy for them, but she had thought she would have seen more of them. She missed having them around. When they were teenagers and under pressure studying for exams, she would prepare a hearty soup for when they were taking a study break, or make some flapjacks for them to nibble at their desk. She would always have a pot of bolognese on the hob, or muffins, freshly baked from the oven, for them and their friends. They used to eat her out of house and home. But after Josh had left for college, the food she put in the fridge after the weekly shop on a Friday was still there the Friday after. She missed it, ferrying them around to their sports and the never-ending cycle of laundry. She missed every bit of it, even the noise. She missed having a busy kitchen. She missed being needed. She had lost her purpose. She was lost in her own life. She had given up her job in the bank after Ella was born. Hugh's business was going well at the time, and she hadn't wanted to be away from her darling baby girl. So it seemed like the best thing to do for their family. And she had been so happy at home with her children for all those years. It had never felt like a sacrifice. She had kept their home running smoothly, while Hugh worked long hours. As his construction company had expanded internationally, he had travelled a lot and spent considerable time away from home. But she never complained, because his success was what gave her children the life that she had never had, a world she could only have ever dreamed about. But as the children had grown older, she had been wondering what she might like to do now that she had more time on her hands. She was at a crossroads in her life as she contemplated her future. She had even thought about going to college. Despite achieving high points in her leaving cert, Laura had got a job in the bank straight after school, because her father had said he couldn't afford to put her through third-level education. She'd always wondered what might have been had she had a chance to go to college. Maybe she would be a high-flying career woman. Maybe she might have been the breadwinner, while Hugh stayed at home to look after the children. But if she did return to education, what on earth would she study? And it made her shudder whenever she thought about how the other students would be the same age as her children. She felt totally overwhelmed by it all, and the decisions that she needed to make. It was bad enough with the children gone, but now Hugh was gone too. It had been 3 weeks since he had left. He had come in the door from work, placed his keys down on the island, and loosened his tie like he did every day. "Hi, love," he had said, flicking through the post. "How was your day?" As if it was any ordinary day, and not the day that she had bumped into Mandy Egan in O'Reilly's supermarket in the village. She didn't go to the big Tesco in Newbridge anymore. She was able to get everything in Ballythomas, now that her weekly shop had dwindled. Mandy had a son the same age as Josh, and the boys had been quite friendly in primary school. They had chatted about the boys and what they were up to, and then Mandy had asked her if Hugh had had a nice time in Galway. Laura had blinked rapidly, trying to catch up with what Mandy was saying. "He was with someone. I thought maybe it was his sister?" But Laura could tell by the way that Mandy's eyes had shifted that she knew it was more than that. She was trying to let Laura know without spelling it out for her. The words had slammed into her like a punch. Hugh had told her that he was working in his construction company's Polish office that weekend. Her first reaction was mortification. How excruciatingly awkward for both of them. She had placed her basket of groceries on the floor, muttered something to Mandy about her parking being up, and ran out of the shop. Deep down, she knew it wasn't the first time that Hugh had cheated on her. She had had her suspicions over the course of their 21-year marriage. She could tell by the pep in his step, the way he seemed distracted, like he was trying to exist in two places at once. The way his kiss, as he hurried out the door in the mornings, never quite landed on her skin, and instead seemed to brush past her face. Then he would be back to himself again after a few weeks, and they would continue on as normal. She had never told any of her friends. She was too ashamed. She could only imagine how her best friend Donna would react if Laura had told her. Donna, with her big career and zero tolerance for bullshit. Donna had never married and was fiercely independent. She would be horrified and ask how Laura could just turn a blind eye to it, pretend it wasn't happening, like some kind of 1950s housewife. The truth was, Laura had never confronted Hugh because she had been afraid. Her family was her number one priority, and she didn't want anything to rock that. So she had just buried her head in the sand about it all. But this time was different. She couldn't use the children as an excuse anymore. Something had screamed inside her that enough was enough. "I know about Galway," she had begun. Her heart was racing, and her palms were clammy. She still hoped there was a mix-up. Maybe it had been perfectly innocent. A work meeting, perhaps. Or an old friend that he'd bumped into at the hotel. But deep down, she knew the truth. And Hugh's eyes had told her everything she needed to know. "I'm sorry," he had begged. "She doesn't mean anything." "Come on, Hugh. We both know it's not the first time." "I'm not trying to make excuses, but I guess I was looking for a connection. We've drifted apart. I miss what we had. We never have sex. We don't even kiss anymore. When the children aren't around, we have nothing to talk about. You have to admit that things haven't been right between us for a long time. You're not yourself lately." So many excuses. She had remembered the silence over their coffee at the breakfast table on the weekend before. She had thought it was because the house was quiet for the first time ever, now that the nest had been emptied, with both children off at college. Bar their usual topics of the kids, or the weather, or whatever political scandal had made the news headlines that day, they had nothing left to say to one another. 21 years of marriage, 2 children, a lifetime of memories, and yet they still had nothing to talk about. She had realised with a shock that Ella and Josh had been the glue holding their family together. Fudgy thoughts had formed in her mind. Why did he keep doing this? Was there something lacking in her? Something that she could do better? She should give him one of those surveys they send you after you get your hair done in the hairdressers. How can we improve? But for some reason, she couldn't be bothered trying to fix it. She couldn't summon the energy and effort. What was wrong with her, she had wondered. She should be angry, perhaps tearful, but she had just felt numb to the whole thing. "I think you should move out for a while." Even as she said the words, it sounded like they were coming from somebody else. "You can't be serious." "I'm sorry. I'll do whatever you want, please," Hugh had begged. "Laura, you have to forgive me. She meant nothing to me." I need some time to think about everything, she'd continued. I know I made a mistake, but please, Laura, just think about this. Think about Ella and Josh. You can't do this to them. What would we tell them? I don't know. But you should have thought about that before your little trip to Galway. Now, I need you to leave. You're actually serious, he had spluttered. You're kicking me out. His eyes were wide with disbelief. She had nodded. Was she really doing this? And why now, she'd wondered. After years of turning a blind eye, why had she decided that she wasn't putting up with Hugh's infidelity any longer? Maybe it was the menopause. She was 44, after all. She just wasn't feeling like herself lately. Maybe she should go to her GP and talk about it all. But where will I go? Where will I stay? I'm sure you'll find somewhere. That had been 3 weeks ago. Hugh had called her several times since then. But she had told him she hadn't made any decisions yet and needed time and space to think. She knew he was hopeful that they would reconcile, but something had changed within her. She still hadn't found a way to tell Ella and Josh, and judging by the phone conversations and text messages she had had from them over the last few days, she knew that Hugh hadn't told them either. It looked like it was going to be left to her to break it to them, and it wasn't a conversation to have over the phone. They wouldn't be home to visit over the Halloween break, so at least that bought her some time. But she might not see the children until Christmas, and she would have to tell them then, and ruin it for everyone. Chapter 3. Sydney, Australia. 5 days later, Penny disembarked at the stop for St Thomas's Hospital and walked across the campus. She had dropped Willow off at preschool, then taken the bus across the city to the hospital. Mrs Sullivan had grumbled something about the house not cleaning itself when Penny had called her to explain that she needed yet another morning off. She stood for a moment in front of a rolling ball fountain and fished the letter from her bag to remind herself of where she was supposed to go. The contemporary geometric shape of the building was clearly designed to be a beacon for modern medicine. But instead of being impressive, Penny found its towering, blocky shapes cold and clinical, bringing into sharp focus the reason why she was here. She entered the building and made her way through the maze of corridors that led to the breast care unit. When she arrived at the reception desk, she checked in and was told to take a seat. The TV in the waiting room was showing the morning show. She looked around at the other women who were waiting to be seen with a sinking feeling. There were loads ahead of her, and she needed to be back in time to collect Willow. Penny Callahan? She eventually heard her name being called by a nurse. She stood up and made her way over to the woman. I'm Wendy, the nurse said, introducing herself when Penny stood up. If you want to follow me, I'll bring you into Dr. Henman. She followed Wendy into an office. I'm Dr. Henman. He reached out his hand to shake hers. Take a seat, he instructed. He was a balding man, she guessed in his mid-50s, and wore wire-rimmed glasses. As Wendy took a seat beside her, Penny took a moment to look around the light-filled office. Files were piled up like miniature tower blocks along the desk. Dr. Henman was obviously a busy man, so why did he need to see her? She felt bad for taking up his time. Did you bring anyone with you today, Miss Callahan? He asked, looking behind her towards the door she had just come through. Well, no. Penny shook her head. Should I have? She asked, suddenly feeling unsure of herself. Well, often people like to have someone accompany them when they get called back for results, he began tentatively. There was something about the pinched expression on his face that told Penny he was holding something back. I didn't think... No, she faltered, feeling stupid now. But even if she had wanted to, who would she have brought? He raised his brows and exchanged a glance with Wendy before continuing. Miss Callahan, as you are aware, we performed a tissue biopsy 2 weeks ago, and I have the results back. He tapped a blue file in front of him. I'm so sorry to have to tell you that, unfortunately, the samples have come back as cancerous, Miss Callahan. Nausea swilled in Penny's stomach, and she felt her fingers clench the sides of the chair. It was as though her blood had turned to treacle as it ran through her veins. Cancer. He was telling her that she had cancer. Her breath was coming shallow and fast. She was desperately trying to find oxygen in the room. As you know, we took samples from 3 areas of concern: your left breast, the lymph nodes, and there was also a spot on your right breast. Unfortunately, they are all cancerous. The words were swimming around in her brain as she wondered what she was meant to do with them. She tried to put them in order, to understand what he was saying, but they just wouldn't make sense. What happens now? She heard herself ask, almost as if she was another party in the room, watching the scene unfold before her. When we see progression to the axillary lymph nodes, it is stage 3. Given the tumour's progression and grade of the cancer, I think in your case it would be prudent to consider a double mastectomy immediately. Then we will start chemotherapy, and most likely radiation treatment after that. We have a full multidisciplinary team reviewing your case closely. All she could do was nod. She was unable to process what the man was saying. His words bounced off her like ping-pong balls. I appreciate it is a lot to get your head around today. You will need support through this. Have you got a partner? Dr. Henman continued. Penny shook her head. What about family support? Have you any relatives close by? I have a daughter. She's 4. Dr. Henman inhaled sharply, and it whistled through his teeth. I see. And what about your parents or siblings? He asked. My family's in Ireland. Penny, I don't want to frighten you, but you will need help through this. It was Wendy's turn to speak now. Not just emotionally, but physically too. The surgery will be tough on you, and chemo is a hard road too. The side effects can be severe. Have you got a friend even who could help you out? Wendy's words brought the reality of the situation home. Penny shook her head. What about your daughter's father? Wendy pressed on. Could he help to care for your daughter on the days when you might not be able to? No, Penny said quickly, shaking her head. I'm all she's got, she added, to further emphasise just how important this was. There was no one else. She couldn't be sick. She needed them to sort this. She needed them to do everything that they could to make her better. All kinds of questions began flitting through her brain. Who would look after Willow if she needed to stay in hospital while she had surgery? Would she be physically up to caring for her when she was going through chemo? Who would take her to preschool if she was feeling sick? Where would she get the money for their rent and food if she couldn't work? How would she keep a roof over their heads? Mrs. Sullivan would hardly pay her sick pay. If you don't have family or friends nearby to help, we can put you in touch with a social work team to get a support plan in place for you and your daughter, Wendy continued. She was smiling kindly at her, trying to reassure her, but her words just seemed to emphasise how alone Penny was. She felt stupid. How had she not realised how vulnerable she was? She had always thought she could protect Willow from anything. She had naively assumed that she was enough to keep her daughter safe, and that she would be there for Willow no matter what. But why had she never stopped to think about what could happen if something were to happen to her? Who would protect Willow then? When Willow was 2, Penny had caught a bad flu, and even though her bones had ached right down to the marrow, and she could hardly keep her eyes open, she had struggled through it, because that was what she had to do. There was no alternative. In situations like these, we can put you in touch with short-term foster carers while you recover. The social workers will know more than me, but they have people who deal with cases like this. I know it's a lot to take in today, but we are here for you. Take a few days to get your head around it all. In the meantime, we will be putting a plan in place for your care. You will be assigned a cancer care nurse, and I can give you the number for the community support team, who can talk you through the specifics of a care plan for your daughter. Penny felt herself freeze. She knew they only wanted to help, but Willow had only ever known her. She didn't even remember her father. She had never had a childminder, or even a relative take care of her. How could they possibly understand that Penny couldn't just entrust a stranger with her care? Panic and sheer terror, the irrational fear that always came whenever she thought about leaving Willow with someone else, seized her chest. Even leaving her at daycare when she was a baby had been a big adjustment for Penny, and it had taken her time to relax and trust that Willow was in safe hands. She could cope with the cancer. She would do what they told her to do. Take the chemo, the surgery, whatever they wanted, she would do it. And she would get better. But she would never give her daughter to a stranger. No way. Outside the hospital, the real world slammed into her. Sirens, horns, alarms that told her this was happening, it wasn't just a dream. Penny sat swaying in her seat as the bus wound its way back through the suburbs. The words of Dr. Henman and Wendy were still ringing in her ears. Cancer. She had cancer. Besides the lump, there had been no other signs. Yes, she had been tired lately, but she had been putting it down to the physical demands of cleaning the Sullivans' house. She could never have imagined it was the result of a tumour stealing her energy. She imagined it eating through her, like those Pac-Man games she had played when she was younger, spreading through her body, a silent invader, an interloper. But there was something worse than the cancer diagnosis worrying her. The fear about what would happen to Willow was bigger than any of that. She wasn't stupid. They hadn't needed to spell it out for her. If she didn't come up with a plan for Willow's care, they would have no choice but to put their own one in place, for the sake of the child's welfare. Then a thought sprang into her head that sent chills down her body. What if they tracked Jack down? His name was on Willow's birth certificate. So what if they decided that as Willow's legal guardian, he was a backup plan for her care? Penny couldn't let him back into their lives again. Jack had destroyed her. There was no way she would let him do that to her daughter, the most precious thing she had. She had spent so long building a new life for them, watching every step they took, making sure their tracks were covered at every turn. And all it would take would be one phone call from the social care team to allow him back into their lives again. Chapter 4. Kildare, Ireland. Winter sunlight streamed in through the French doors and glinted off the veins running through the marble countertop. The ticking clock on the wall counted down the beat of a day that stretched endlessly before her. Laura's housekeeper, Aurelia, would be here soon. But there was nothing for her to do, because she'd already done it all. They had bought this rambling old Victorian house, situated in the sleepy village of Ballythomas, in the heart of the Kildare countryside, when the children had been small. The village was set on a bend of the River Liffey, and there wasn't much to it, apart from O'Reilly's grocery store, 3 pubs, a primary school, a GAA club, and the spire of St. Kevin's Church keeping a watchful eye over the village. Laura had wanted to live somewhere rural, but commutable to Dublin for Hugh's work, and Ballythomas seemed like the perfect compromise. The house had been a mess back then, with an ancient plumbing system and no central heating. The old lady that they had bought it from had only used one room because the house was so draughty and damp. But as soon as Laura had driven up the long avenue, seeing the acres of fields for the children to play in, and the river meandering at the bottom of the garden, She knew it was the house where she wanted to raise her family. And so they had set about painstakingly renovating it into a comfortable family home. The boughs of the majestic oak trees that sheltered the garden had made wonderful climbing spots for the children when they were young, and Hugh had built a panoramic treehouse for them, set high up in the branches. During the school holidays, Laura would pack a picnic basket for Ella and Josh to take up there to eat, and she would wave them off on their little adventure. She could still see them now, Ella in a blue cotton summer dress, and Josh in his denim shorts and t-shirt, tearing across the grass towards the ladder. How idyllic those days had been. It had been a long time since either of them had set foot in the treehouse. What she wouldn't give to be able to go back there, even just for a few minutes, and relive it all again. Her own upbringing had been a world away from this picture-perfect home. Her mother had died young, and her father, unable to cope, had turned to drink, pissing away whatever he earned in his weekly pay packet from the biscuit factory in the Al Shabeen pub every night. There had been no pressed uniforms or freshly packed school lunches. The St. Vincent de Paul had been their saviour. They would bring milk, bread, eggs and cereal, so that Laura could try to cobble something together for dinner. They brought shoes and clothing passed down from better-off families. One time, the lady from the St. Vincent de Paul had given her a beautiful lemon-yellow dress, with a beaded blue forget-me-not pattern trailing the end. This dress had stood out amongst the thread-worn tracksuit bottoms and raggedy woolen jumpers that were usually donated by the St. Vincent de Paul. Laura knew it had probably only been worn once, and judging by the weight of the fabric, the intricacy of the beading, and the neat stitching, had cost a lot of money. She had been invited to a birthday party for Karen Stewart in her class, and when she'd seen the dress, Laura was so excited to wear it. The silk had been cool against her skin.